There was a term that I heard which said Masterplan to end child labor. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
So I think Nepal's made a huge amount of progress in ending or reducing formal child labor, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But there's still not enough information about child labor in the informal sector. So, whether that's agriculture or whether that's, the more unregulated sector, there's still, I think, a big issue. And I think you have a very kind of open border, so it's quite hard to sometimes regulate people moving back and forth and checking to make sure abuses aren't happening. But there is actually a really strong movement, and our team and our protection colleagues, this is a protection issue. Every child has the right to go to school. They're children, so they should be at school, they should be learning, they should be playing. And we don't oppose, helping out at the household or things like this that need to be done. We don't have to do chores at home. But that's very different than kind of sending someone off to work in their home or working in the fields with such long hours that it interferes with that. So I think the master plan, that sounds actually very, very exciting and big, but I think the idea is to really get everyone involved from all sectors and get commitment, because it actually really hurts the GDP. When you have children working at this age, they actually don't become more productive workers later. That's not why we're fighting against it, but it's a good argument to come. If you have someone who's working at 11 years old, that interferes with them becoming a much more productive person. They haven't gone to school, they haven't gotten the skill sets, and all those kind of negative things associated, frequently child marriage, all those things come along kind of hand in hand with those things, and then you end up having a less productive workforce, a less productive economy. So I think it's also about giving that message, because again, it's hard to say to a family who might be in dire financial straits, don't send your children to work, but it's also about providing them positive opportunities and saying, well, look at your children as, an investment to their future and your future as well, that when they're older, they can bring a lot more for themselves. They'll be in a much better place and can help the family out too. So
and how close are we to eliminating it? Pretty close. I hope so.
I think in the formal sector, there's been huge progress, and I think we're very close. I think it's the informal sector where we just need more information to really understand it. More information on how much child labor there actually is. No one knows. And then better strategies, because it's quite easy for us to regulate in the formal sector. There's laws, there's things in place that stop it. But the informal sector, same thing with collecting tax or anything else, it's much harder to regulate, and that's where a lot of the abuses are happening. And probably better inter-border cooperation as well.
That's where I was getting into as well. We've got because of the open border as well. And I'm not just talking about in general, I was just thinking about this, not just kids within our country, probably kids from India will come over and work here as well. That's somehow we got to figure out a way to go ahead and double check that as well.
I mean, the open border, brings lots of opportunities for Nepal, but also a lot of issues, right? There's a lot of diseases that come back and forth. It's much harder for tuberculosis, for example. Much harder for people to complete their medications, their regimes. As we talked about education earlier, children are often migrating with their parents, and then they don't have the opportunity. They're leaving the school year for months out of the year. So, I mean, and I think there's a lot of people really working on it and seeing what can we do, but nothing that any of us are going to solve overnight. But I think there's some good work being on, and a much better understanding that we have to be able to help people on both sides of the borders. And we'll see. I mean, this is also about the children's voice too, because we hear plenty about child marriage. We hear plenty about beating in schools, but we're not getting the phone calls about child labor per se. So that could be because there's hopefully not as much, but it could also be that these children don't have a voice. And this is what I talked about, the informal sector. So I think there's a lot of work for all of us to understand how can we get these children a voice and make sure that they know that they can have this recourse if they're working, if they're doing this, that they can call, and that there'll be someone to assist them and help them at the end.
Exactly. I believe that's the most important thing. They need that support.